Cassie wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her wrist, smudging a streak of grease across her cheek. The sun was ruthless that day, beating down on the cracked concrete lot of her father's old garage in a small Kansas town that hadn't changed in 30 years. She leaned over the open hood of a rusty sedan, listening for the rattle that had been driving its owner crazy for weeks. She loved engines, loved the puzzle of it, the hum and click and grind that spoke to her clearer than most people ever did. She heard the sputtering cough of an older pickup crawling toward the shop. Cassie glanced up just in time to see a battered blue Chevy, fender dented, paint faded to chalky patches, shuddering to a stop at the edge of the lot. She saw a man behind the wheel, white hair peeking from under a battered cap, eyes weary but alert. The old man stepped out stiffly, using the truck door to balance himself. Cassie wiped her hands on her jeans and walked over, the heat radiating off the pavement like a second sun. "Afternoon, sir," she called, putting on her best easy smile. The man looked up, returned her nod, and tried to smile back. Up close, she could see the lines on his face, deep, like the furrows in dry farmland. "Truck giving you trouble?" she asked. The man pushed his cap back with a gnarled hand and let out a tired chuckle. "Been giving me trouble since '72, he said. Cassie laughed softly and stuck out her hand. "Name's Cassie. What seems to be the worst of it today?" He introduced himself as Henry, a retired farmer who still drove the same Chevy he'd bought when his eldest was born. "Was on my way into town for a couple of parts," he said, "and she just up and died on me. Managed to coast down the hill to your place. Must be my lucky day." Cassie didn't tell him that most folks wouldn't call it luck. She motioned him to the little bench outside the garage door. "You sit, I'll take a look." She lifted the hood, propped it with her shoulder, and leaned in. Cassie knew the heart of an engine, like she knew the sound of her own breath. She poked around, checking hoses, looking for leaks, tapping wires, flicking away oil grit. She talked to Henry while she worked, her voice drifting through the open hood. He told her about his farm 30 miles out, the wheat that barely survived last season's drought, the son who moved to Ohio, the wife who'd been gone 10 years now, but still showed up in his dreams wearing the same apron she'd worn since he bought this truck. She liked listening to people like Henry. He didn't complain about the hard parts of life like some did. He just carried it in the bend of his back, the way he rubbed his hands together while he talked, the faraway look he got when he paused between sentences. Cassie found the trouble quicker than she'd hoped. A clogged fuel filter, a rusted clamp she'd have to replace, maybe a spark plug on its last leg. She didn't tell him all, that yet. She just asked if he was hungry, handed him a cold bottle of Coke from the mini-fridge, and told him she'd get him back on the road. She slid under the truck, greasy ponytail brushing the cracked pavement. She didn't mind the grit, the sweat soaking her collar, or the way the hot metal singed her fingertips when she reached for the bolts. To her, fixing something felt better than being anywhere else. Oh, better than her cramped apartment above the shop. Better than sitting in a diner with people who asked her when she'd find a real job, or why she wasted her talent on engines instead of college. And she never had the answer that shut them up for good. Hours rolled by. The sun dipped lower. Henry sat quietly, sometimes telling her about old farm dogs, sometimes just watching the street like he was waiting for someone he hadn't seen in years. Cassie came up for air once in a while, offered him an ice pack when she saw him rubbing his knee. She found an old clamp that fit, rummaged through dusty drawers, until she found the right filter, and cursed when her wrench slipped and skinned her knuckle. Henry offered to help, but she shook her head. "This old girl's in good hands," she said, patting the fender. When she finally turned the ignition, the Chevy groaned awake, then settled into a low, steady purr. Henry looked at her like she'd done magic. He stood up, slower than she liked, and dug into his wallet with trembling fingers. He pulled out a crumpled 20, pressed it toward her. Cassie stepped back, palms up. "No, sir, she's good to go. You keep that for gas, or pie, or whatever you want." Henry insisted, voice tight with embarrassment. But Cassie wouldn't take it. To her, it was nothing. A half-day's work to get an old farmer home safe. Henry's eyes watered a little as he tucked the bill back inside his wallet. He thanked her twice, 3 times, and promised her he'd come back. He'd find a way to repay her somehow. Cassie just waved him off, wiping sweat and oil from her face, watching his taillights bounce down the cracked country road until they disappeared behind a row of sycamores that hadn't changed since she was a kid. She didn't expect anything in return. She liked that about herself. She'd learned it from her dad before he passed. You fix what you can, help when you can, and hope the world circles it back someday. When the sun dipped below the grain silos, Cassie locked up the garage, flicked off the old buzzing neon sign that hadn't been replaced since the 80s, and climbed the narrow steps to her apartment. She ate leftover noodles straight from the fridge, toes propped on the wobbly table, grease still under her nails. She thought about Henry for a second. Wondered if his farm still smelled like fresh-cut hay, if his fields would look gold in the moonlight. Then she fell asleep on the couch, TV humming static she couldn't afford to fix. In the morning, Cassie went back to work like always. She patched up busted radiators, replaced worn brake pads, told teenagers not to redline their hand-me-down Mustangs. Some days she made enough to buy new filters and gloves. Some days she didn't. She kept an old coffee can under the counter labeled "Someday" in black marker. Inside were a few wrinkled bills, a handful of quarters, and one bright idea, a dream to buy new lifts, new tools, maybe expand the shop, hire one more set of hands. But that was for later. For now, she had engines to fix. 3 weeks drifted by like oil down an old drain. The rain came and went, washing dust off the tin roof of the shop. Cassie barely noticed the days. She stayed busy, humming along to old country songs on the battered radio, sometimes stopping to watch trucks rumble by on the main road. She thought about Henry once in a while, but mostly she just hoped he'd gotten home safe, that he'd told his farm dog the whole adventure, that his wife in his dreams was still wearing that same apron, still smiling at him the way he remembered. Cassie was under the hood of an old Ford when she heard the rumble of an unfamiliar engine outside. She wiped her hands on a rag, peeking through the open garage door. At first, she thought it was a delivery truck backing in by mistake, but then she saw the shiny new flatbed idling by the gravel drive. The paint gleamed like polished silver, reflecting the morning sun that crept past the silos. She squinted as a man in a crisp polo shirt hopped down from the driver's seat, holding a clipboard like he owned the world. The driver found her standing by the workbench, arms crossed. He looked at her name patch, said, "Cassie Miller," like he wasn't sure if he had the right dusty garage. She nodded, heart thumping harder than she liked to admit. He flipped through papers, explaining he had a delivery for her. A surprise, he said, fully paid, signature required. She frowned. She didn't order anything. She hadn't bought a single new part in months. Her tools were old but loyal. She asked him who sent it, but he just smiled, said his job was to drop it off. Cassie stepped outside, boots crunching on gravel. The driver pulled back the tarp, and her breath caught. Sitting on the flatbed was a gleaming new hydraulic car lift, the kind she'd dreamed of but never imagined she'd own. Beside it were 3 heavy boxes sealed with factory tape, branded with a big tool company's logo. She recognized the name. Top-shelf gear she'd only ever seen in glossy catalogs that she used to circle like wish lists she'd never mail. For a moment she thought it had to be a mistake, some lucky shop owner down the road. The driver handed her the clipboard again. Inside the plastic sleeve was a note, written on lined paper, signed in a shaky hand she recognized immediately. It was Henry's name, big and proud. The note said only, "For Cassie, who saved an old man more than just a truck. May this help you fix what you dream of." She read it twice before she could trust her eyes. The driver waited while she wiped her eyes on her sleeve. Then she signed her name, like her hands didn't know what to do. Together they unloaded everything. Cassie stood there watching as the flatbed backed down the lane, leaving behind the brand-new lift, shiny steel, gleaming like a promise in the sun. She almost didn't know what to touch first. She ran her hand along the smooth metal, fingertips catching on the embossed brand name. It smelled like factory grease and new paint, a smell she'd never had in her shop before. She thought about her father then, how he used to swear by his battered old floorjack, telling her they didn't need anything fancy as long as they had grit. She spent the next few hours hauling boxes inside, arranging the tools on the empty shelves she'd always meant to fill. She unpacked wrenches that fit together perfectly, sockets that didn't slip or rust. The new lift took some work to bolt in place. She did it mostly alone, like she did everything. But halfway through, Benny, the high school kid who hung around sometimes, wandered in and offered to help. She showed him how to line up the bolts, how to check the seals, how to test the hydraulics twice before trusting it with 2 tons of American steel. News spread fast in a town like hers. By the next day, old customers poked their heads in, whistling at the shiny lift, asking if she'd hit the lottery. She just smiled and said she had a friend who believed in second chances. Word got around to the parts guy at the supply store, then the mail lady who always dropped her bills by hand so she could chat for 5 minutes about her grandkids. By Saturday, half the town knew Cassie had a lift, real tools, and maybe, just maybe, bigger dreams than anyone thought. With the new equipment, she worked faster. She could finally take the bigger jobs she used to pass on because her old rig wouldn't lift anything heavier than a rusty Civic. Farmers brought in tractors that hadn't moved in years. Young kids with souped-up pickups wanted her to install lift kits, turbochargers, the works. She charged fair, she fixed things right, and she didn't cut corners. Henry's gift turned her dusty one-bay shop into something that looked like a future. Every time she leaned over an engine hoisted high by that new lift, she thanked him under her breath. Winter came early that year. Snow settled on the roof. Icy wind blew through the gaps in the shop's old garage door. But Cassie stayed warm under the hood, working late, the new tools gleaming under bright bulbs she finally replaced. Sometimes she'd look at the empty stool by the workbench and imagine Henry sitting there, telling her about the wheat harvest, the smell of fresh bread his wife used to bake, the way that old Chevy had been part of every big moment in his life. She liked to think he knew what she did with his gift. One evening, just before closing, a black SUV pulled into the lot. She almost waved it off. She was bone-tired, sleeves stained, hair pulled back with a wrench holding it in place. But the driver stepped out wearing a suit, shoes polished, tie still perfect, even though the wind bit hard enough to make her shiver. He introduced himself as Henry's son. She didn't know him, hadn't expected to ever see him. He looked at the lift, at the boxes neatly stacked, the shine of the new tools. Then he looked at her, eyes softer than she expected. He thanked her for helping his father that day, for refusing his money, for treating him like he still mattered when half the world saw nothing but old age and rust. Cassie just shrugged, said it was nothing, just a day's work. But the man shook his head, told her it wasn't nothing to Henry, that it gave him something to hold on to in those final months. Cassie froze. She didn't know he was gone. The man saw the look on her face and reached into his coat, pulling out a small envelope. He handed it to her gently. Inside was a letter, Henry's handwriting again. He thanked her one last time for seeing him, for fixing more than an engine, for fixing something inside him that felt forgotten. With the letter was a small check, enough to fix her cracked garage door, maybe patch the roof, maybe even repaint the faded sign her father had painted when she was 12. She didn't know if she'd cash it, maybe she would. Maybe she'd frame it. She didn't cry until the SUV's taillights vanished down the road, swallowed by snow swirling under the street lamp. After that, Cassie worked like she always did, but something was different. She took on bigger jobs, hired Benny part-time, taught him how to balance a carburetor by ear like her father taught her. She cleaned the shop every Friday, made it shine like she knew Henry would have liked. She kept the coffee can on the shelf, but now she wrote, "Someday is today," in bold black letters across the side. Every time she dropped a bill in, she remembered the old Chevy's purr when it rolled out that lot, the sound of second chances. Word spread far past the town. Truckers came in off the highway saying they heard about a girl who could fix anything with nothing but heart and a socket wrench. Local shops sent her the work they couldn't handle. She didn't say no. She didn't raise her prices just because she could. She figured the world had been kind to her in the strangest way, and she'd keep circling it back, same as her father did, same as Henry did, with one final gift that turned a lonely dream into something alive. Years later, when they asked Cassie how she built the best little garage for 100 miles, she'd just smile. She'd tell them about a man in a battered cap, a farm that smelled like fresh-cut hay, and a Chevy that coughed and wheezed but never really gave up. She'd tell them about a flatbed that showed up one morning and changed her life with bolts, gears, and a letter that still hung on her office wall, framed in cracked walnut, reminding her every day that you fix what you can and hope the world circles it back.